Welcome to and how to be healthier at discussing of aging. I'm David Sinclair. I'm a professor at Harvard Medical School who researches the biology of aging, and I'm co-director of the Center for the Biology of Aging. And I'm joined by my co-host and co-author, Matthew LaPlante.
Hey, we're back.
Hey, welcome. Good to see you again.
It's good to see you again, too.
This is episode 2. We're going to be covering when to eat and also what to eat within 24-hour periods as well as over a year. Not just to maximize your wellness and how you feel and look, but how to maximize your overall longevity. I'm going to talk about some of my protocols as well that I've developed over the last 20 years being a researcher in this area and what works for me and what might work for you as well. If you missed episode 1, don't worry, we're going to cover the basics here, but you might want to go back and listen to episode 1 because we cover some of the fundamental biology that may help you understand what we're going to talk about today, even in more detail. So Matt, how have you been, man?
I'm good. Before we get started, we gotta thank the sponsors.
We do. Let's go straight into that.
Yeah.
It's important that we thank the sponsors because this podcast comes to you free. And we also get a chance to highlight some of the products that we love and have been using now for many years. Our first sponsor is Levels. Levels is an app that syncs with a continuous glucose monitor, which they provide, and interprets your glucose data for you. I've been so impressed by Levels that I've recently joined the company as an advisor. By monitoring your blood glucose, Levels allows you to see how different foods impact you. I've had fun running tests of my own, seeing how different foods impact my blood sugar levels. For example, I've learned that white rice and grapes really spike my blood sugar, whereas potatoes don't. As we've discussed on this podcast, having stable blood glucose is really important, not only for your daily mental and physical energy, but also for long-term health. If you would like to try Levels, you can skip the 150,000 people on the wait list and join them today by going to levels.link/Sinclair. That's levels.link/Sinclair. Today's podcast is also brought to us by Athletic Greens. Athletic Greens is an all-in-one daily greens drink that supports better health and peak performance. It's developed from a complex blend of 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food-sourced ingredients. It's filled with adaptogens for recovery, probiotics, prebiotics, and digestive enzymes for gut health. They also have vitamin C and zinc citrate for immune support. I've been drinking Athletic Greens for a number of years now as a way to cover all my nutritional bases. I'm often traveling, and sometimes my diet just isn't the best. So by drinking Athletic Greens every morning, I know I'm getting all the vitamins and minerals that I need to stay healthy. If you'd like to try Athletic Greens, you should go to athleticgreens.com/Sinclair and you can claim a special offer. They're giving 5 free travel packs plus a year's supply of vitamin D3 and K2. Vitamin D3 is important for the immune system, and vitamin K2 is really important for keeping the calcium out of your arteries and putting it into your bones where it belongs. So again, go to athleticgreens.com/Sinclair and claim this special offer. Today's podcast is also brought to us by Inside Tracker. Inside Tracker is a personalized nutrition platform that analyzes data from your blood and your DNA to help you better understand your body and to reach your health goals. I've been using Inside Tracker for over a decade now, and I'm the chair of their scientific advisory board. The reason I've long used Inside Tracker is because they provide the best blood and DNA analysis that I'm aware of. They make it easy to get your blood drawn. You can either go to a local clinic or, like I do, have someone come to your home. It only takes 10 or 15 minutes. It's really easy. And from there, Inside Tracker presents your blood analysis in an easy to understand way. There are graphs and they give you diet and lifestyle recommendations that help you improve your blood biomarkers. Another feature that Inside Tracker has is their inner age test, which I helped develop. The test shows you what your biological age is, how it compares to your chronological age, and what you can do to improve that number. So if you'd like to try Inside Tracker, you should visit them at insidetracker.com/Sinclair, and you'll get 25% off any Inside Tracker plan. Use the code Sinclair, my last name, at the checkout.
Okay, so David, when we sat down together 3-4 years ago, we started mapping out this book. And I said, look, I need you to give me one starting place. When we're talking about health advice, like there's so much health information out there. I need you to give me one starting place. And you said immediately, you're like, I know, the one thing. So let's start there
right
today because it relates to this episode. The one starting place,
is, wait for it, drum roll,
drum roll, for longevity, the one starting place is?
eat less often. Those 3 words, eat less often. That is the one thing that'll have the biggest impact on your longevity based on all the science we'll talk about today.
Okay. And this doesn't mean eat fewer calories
It
necessarily.
can,
It can,
but
and
doesn't
that's
have
good.
to. Yes.
That's good. But a lot of people struggle to do that, to eat fewer calories.
Well, it comes naturally. If you're down to 1 meal a day, which I am now, you shed weight and then you get your 20-year-old body back. That's a nice bonus. But then you maintain that weight. You have a larger dinner, which is what I do to make sure I'm not becoming malnourished. Clearly, we're not talking about malnutrition or starvation here. It's about packing your calories into a shorter period of time.
That's because packing your meals into a shorter period almost inevitably means less calories, but that's not really what's happening here, right? It's not just about less calories. It's about what eating less often does inside of our bodies.
Right, and we'll get to that. But really, it's not just about the period of eating. It's the period of not eating that's so important for boosting the body's defenses against aging to maximize longevity. And we'll talk about how that actually works in a minute. But you can still have a large body and fast and get the benefits. In my lab, we've looked at mice that are obese and tricked them into thinking that they're fasted, and they live just as long as a skinny mouse. So really, it's about getting your body into this state of defense at any weight. Though I would say that there are certain optimal body weights that it's clear that if you're carrying excess weight, you're going to accelerate your aging clock.
What we don't want people to do is get the idea, though, that, oh, good, this works even if you're overweight, and so I can stay overweight, and then as long as I fast a little, it's going to be fine. That's not what you're saying also.
Right. There are certain body weights, waist to height ratios that are optimal for humans is about 0.5. But yeah, losing weight is helpful. We're not fat shaming anybody, but we're going through the science. This podcast is about what the science says, not what's socially acceptable. And it is true that if you're leaner, you will live longer. That is a fact. It's not necessary to get benefits by doing what we're going to say. But also, interestingly, as a side effect of eating less often, you will lose weight. I did. I've shed about 15 pounds since the beginning of the pandemic. And I look better. I feel better. And it's a nice side effect. But ultimately, what we're going to do here is we're going to say, these are the kind of things you should consider in your lifestyle. We're going to help you get there. We're going to ease you into it. There are some tricks that make it easier. And ultimately, you're going to end up with a lifestyle and hopefully a body that allows you to live decades longer.
We've made the promise on this program to really stick to the science, to let people know when the science is coming from studies involving animals, when the science is coming from studies involving human beings. The caveat here is really important. Most fasting research has been conducted so far on model organisms. But what we're seeing in those model organisms is fairly universal.
Well, it is. And the most reliable way to extend lifespan of any animal or even a yeast cell is to restrict its calories.
Well, let's start there because you started your career in yeast. You still study yeast. And one of the really big breakthroughs in understanding how to extend a yeast's lifespan came in your lab when you were studying what happens when yeast are calorie restricted.
Right. And that was the goal. The reason I went into aging research in part and why I was so optimistic about being able to have a big impact is that we know that restricting calories works on everything from a yeast to a spider, a fish, a worm, Labrador, pet Labradors. In 2002, there was a great study that showed you could lengthen lifespan of the Labradors from, 12 years to 14.
This is 1.8 years. And the only difference really was a 25% reduction in calories in that study.
That's remarkable. So I went to MIT in the 90s saying, I want to figure out how the heck this stuff works. How does this diet work? Because then we can bottle it. And we're basically at that point now. But to your point, just taking a pill isn't sufficient. If you add the pills plus the diet, you get an additive doubling effect. So we're going to go through supplements in another episode. Today, it's all about how to maximize when to eat and what to eat.
And that's really important because, look, not everybody can take supplements. Not everybody can access the supplements. What we're going to talk about a lot of things, including things that you can do with, $10 in your pocket and things you can do and $100 in your pocket. But this is something you can do with whatever you're paying right now for food.
Well, it saves money,
You
actually.
can do it.
Yeah, you eat.
It just saves like you spend less on food.
Right. And the kinds of food we're going to recommend are fairly cheap foods. But getting back to yeast, I went to MIT to study this little fungus. It's a yeast cell you use to make bread and beer. It's microscopic. If you put 10 of them together, you might see them as a little dot. That's how small they are. But I used to love yeast. Literally, I would name them. They were little pets under the microscope. I'd follow them through their lifespan.
Adorable.
Yeah, I would get really sad when they would die after about a week because I got to know them. I would spend 14, actually more, probably 16 hours a day helping them along in their life, taking away their daughters, which is how we count that.
David, if you love something, you really shouldn't take its children away. That's pretty messed up.
That's true. If you leave the daughters, unfortunately, there's about 5 million of them by the end of the experiment, and you can't find the original mother. That's the reason.
Things they divide and they expand and they expand and they expand.
Exponentially, right? So you got to get rid of those daughters. You don't kill the daughters, you just move them away. But what we found was that when you reduce the amount of sugar in the plate, so they eat glucose, that's what we gave them, 2% glucose makes them live about 25 divisions, daughters. If you restrict that down to 0.5 glucose, so now down to 25% of that concentration, they will live over 30. And that's really cool, right? That you can just by changing the glucose levels, and we'll get to how that works in humans, very similar, you can extend lifespan. And what we showed was that there's a set of genes that controls that process. This isn't just glucose hurting the cell. There's a genetic pathway that gets triggered by low energy. And these genes we talked about in last episode, they're called sirtuins. And there are 5 of these genes in yeast and 7 in our bodies. And they respond to low energy. They respond to other stresses as well, such as high heat, low amino acids, high salt. The sirtuins will get activated by these, what we call hormetic effects. What doesn't kill them makes them stronger. And in this case, low energy led to the activation of these enzymes called sirtuins. And then they took care of the DNA repair and also stabilization of the epigenome. Now,
okay, there's a lot there. We got to back. Let's slow this down and pace this out. Let's start with sirtuins. What's actually happening when, in the case of yeast or any organism in this case, because it's very similar mechanisms, right? What's actually happening with the sirtuins when yeast or any other model organism is calorie restricted, is fasted?
Yeah. Well, their role is to extend the lifespan. So what they're doing down at the very minute part of the cell is they're protecting DNA and making sure genes stay on when they should be on. But what's happening to boost their activity during caloric restriction, this low glucose level, we managed to figure out in the first couple of years when I moved my lab to Harvard Medical School, or started my lab at Harvard Medical School, we found that low energy activates a certain gene. It has a name. It's called PNC1. We have an equivalent gene in our bodies called NAMPT, and fuel for the sirtuins called NAD. And so in our bodies as well, when we're hungry, these genes come on that make more NAD, this very small molecule that the sirtuins need for fuel. And then they do the protection. They repair DNA and they stabilize the epigenome.
And this is sort of the beginning place that led to NAD boosters, where we started going, oh, well, if we can boost NAD in other ways. And that's not, we'll talk about boosters in another episode, but just to sort of put that in the chronology of how this revelation came about and why so many people are now taking NR and NMN.
Yeah, that came out of our lab. We found 2 ways to activate the sirtuins synthetically. One was to use the red wine molecule, resveratrol, plus some other plant molecules that are now used in the supplement market. And that was a big craze in the 2000s from our lab. And then the second one, which is now probably an even bigger craze, is the NAD booster. And a lot of people are shooting themselves up with NAD or taking NAD precursor supplements. You mentioned NR and NMN. We'll get to those in another episode. But you can mimic low glucose in these yeast cells by giving them these NAD boosters. Or you can turn on this PNC1 gene artificially and they live longer in all cases. And we found that if we deleted that sirtuin gene in the yeast, either one of them or multiple ones, then caloric restriction in the yeast didn't work anymore, which told us that this wasn't just glucose being bad for you. Glucose doesn't hurt you. It's that the low glucose is activating the natural defense state of that cell, which we have inherited over the billions of years since we separated.
People are just going to cut out that little part where you just say glucose isn't bad for you, and they're just going to play that on a loop, and it's going to be great.
All right. Well, glucose is bad for you, but not for the reason that you might think.
So we have a little better understanding now of how sirtuins are turned on by fasting. We talked about two other classes of longevity genes in the first episode, mTOR and AMPK. Do you want to go really briefly through how these genes are impacted when we restrict calories, when we fast?
The first one is mTOR, which stands for mammalian target of rapamycin, the drug rapamycin. We talked a little bit about it in the last episode, but let's refresh everybody's memory. This is a protein complex in the cell that registers amino acids. When you have a lot of protein, you eat a big steak, it's going to activate this mTOR protein complex that allows the cell, causes the cell to build things. It's one of the reasons eating steak allows you to build more muscle, but that's not a recipe for longevity. What we know from many animal studies, even in yeast, if you downregulate the activity of this mTOR protein complex, you get longer life. Why? Because it's activating a process called autophagy, which recycles proteins. So when you're hungry, this autophagy will get all the old proteins, put them in the recycling bin, and then bring them out as fresh proteins. And that seems to be really important for longevity. In fact, even if you just inhibit mTOR and stimulate autophagy, that's sufficient to extend the lifespan of flies and even mice by dramatic amounts, even 30%.
So in mTOR, we start with fasting, we get longevity. In sirtuins, we start with fasting, we get longevity. In AMPK,
same thing.
same thing.
But in
a different process.
Exactly, it's doing something else.
Right.
And in this case, when you're hungry, AMPK will go up. AMPK, if you're wondering, it stands for AMP-activated kinase, and that's just an enzyme that responds to low energy. So when you're hungry, you'll make more of it. And one of the main things that it does is it makes more mitochondria. We lose mitochondria as we get older, and when we exercise, we get more. And this is a way of artificially stimulating that production. Why do we need more mitochondria? Well, they're important for metabolizing things that you eat, but one of the main things that they are used for is to make energy, chemical energy. So when you activate AMPK, you'll feel better, you'll have more energy, and you'll also fight aging.
And you're using the words "you'll" a lot here. You're talking about like you, presumably the people watching and listening to this are human beings. But we should note that, again, much of this research got done in model organisms. Human studies are a lot tougher.
But we have them for humans.
We do have them for human, but there are fewer of them, and they're like most of the sample sizes are much smaller.
Yeah, but there's enough known about both mTOR and AMPK to make pretty strong conclusions that these are beneficial to human health as well. For example,
But this is, I guess what I'm getting at here though is the reason why I think a lot of people would hear, well, there's all these animal studies, we're making all these conclusions on animal studies, and you don't have that many human studies. But human studies they take a really long time. They're really expensive.
well, sure, and until this is 100% proven, many of us will be dead. So the point is, we're going to give people the information in this podcast, and in the notes, we're going to provide references they can read more to make informed decisions about whether they're going to try certain diets, lifestyles, and even medicines and supplements.
So what we know from studies of mTOR, AMPK, sirtuins, this tells our cells that times are tough. This triggers this metabolic shift into a different form of energy. And all of that, not all of that, but much of that we know from animal studies. As we mentioned before, the majority of the research on lifespan extension comes from model organisms, comes from animals that aren't us. But we're not just entering, we're in a world right now where we're doing this research on human beings as well.
We are. It's a fascinating time because we've got two worlds, and I walk in both worlds. One is there's clinical studies being done, some of which I'm involved in with NAD boosters at Harvard. We've been testing 2 years of those in humans, placebo-controlled, double-blind trial.
Like the gold standard stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
And those go to scientific publications. But because people can read the literature and hear about things, there's this self-experimentation world as well. A lot of it on the west coast of the USA. And you hear stuff, and these are anecdotal, but they also are interesting anecdotes that guide the clinical trials. And it's this very interesting time where we're in, where there are parts of the population, let's call it 1% of the US, that is not waiting for the proof that this works. But I do want to say before we move on that there is pretty good evidence that modulating these defenses in the body in humans also works and should extend longevity. We're not just blind and, I'm not crazy experimenting on myself and my father. What we know actually is that drugs that inhibit mTOR, rapamycin, in low dose, intermittent, does mimic fasting and does boost immunity and does give biochemical changes that mimic fasting and predict longevity. And there are people that are taking rapamycin. Again, we'll talk about that in episode 5. But there's also metformin, which is a diabetes drug, and that activates AMPK. And that's also, by looking at tens of thousands of people who take metformin for type 2 diabetes, been shown to slow down the occurrence, not just of diabetes, but other diseases of aging. Together, just those facts that I've told you make me convinced that fasting and the drugs that mimic fasting are going to be important for long-term health, but also wellness in your body today.
There's this other way of knowing, this other form of evidence for this that we haven't talked about yet that I think is important to bring up here. There's the double-blind placebo-controlled studies that are ongoing right now that are showing, an impact in fasting on longevity. There's, like you say, the experimental, like really interesting, like, wow, that guy's looking really good and he's been fasting sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
But then there's these large populations